Okay, there we go. So the broadcast has started now, and I'd like to welcome my opponent, TeaPatriot, to this debate. We're debating the minimum wage. Specifically, we're debating two different advocacies on the minimum wage. I'm debating for a $15 minimum wage, whereas my opponent, TeaPatriot, is debating for no minimum wage whatsoever. And those are the two positions we will hold to, and those are the two positions we will advocate for. I will start off the debate, and we'll have two 7-minute speeches followed by a crossfire, and then we'll repeat that process, and then we'll have two 5-minute speeches to cap this off. So I'll start us off, starting now. So when it comes to the minimum wage, the current minimum wage is about $7.25 in the United States. That's where we're focused on, and so that's where we're going to focus our talk right now. The $7.25 minimum wage is just significantly too low, and it's because it's too low that I am advocating for an increase to that minimum wage. Now, the $15 minimum wage doesn't have to immediately start, but the idea is that we would transition to that over the course of several years, and that should be the standard minimum wage. And I have two major reasons for that. The first reason, the first advantage that I have for this is poverty. Now, there is a clear and present problem in this country of poverty. Millions live in poverty because they cannot afford basic things that are required for the sustaining of their lives. And as a result, they're required to get funding from the federal government in order to stay in a decent state. That's why welfare exists. That's why Medicaid exists. It's meant specifically for people with low means who would otherwise function without, to get things that they need. Unfortunately, those programs cost quite a bit, and they're being taken out of basic tax funding that we have. The other aspect is that there is a much larger rich-poor gap in this country than has ever existed before. The amount of people who live in poverty it continue to grow, whereas the number of people, the actual wealth of the rich continues to go up at a dramatic pace. That's why the poor can only, that's mainly because the poor can only acquire minimum wage jobs. They can only acquire things that are below a standard set of wages that would be required for survival. $7.25 is not enough to live on in many parts of this country. And as a result, they end up having to do multiple things in order to recover those funds. Getting them through welfare and Medicaid isn't always easy enough, and sometimes they have to do multiple things, like working multiple jobs in order to get through that. As a result, they end up costing themselves a lot of their stamina. They have to cut back on basic necessities as they're going through that. And that means they get to spend less time with their kids if they have a family, which disadvantages them as they grow and relegates them to a lower education and a more difficult time in life. Essentially, it's a cycle of poverty. It's creating more poverty as they go forward because they're not able to get out of this space where the only job they can get is a minimum wage job. And we need some way to provide these people with the ability for social mobility. And so this is all with a basic minimum wage. Just recall that. If we actually remove the minimum wage, it gets a lot worse because that is a floor. That's a basic level. If it goes below that, that means it actually gets even worse for these people, and they have to work more than 2 jobs, which is impossible since we're talking about just a 24-hour day. So on a general level, the $15 minimum wage obviates these issues. It ensures that a single job can meet the level of funding required to obtain the necessities for life without government help. Rather than taxpayers subsidizing their survival, workers will be paid enough to live anywhere in the country and thrive in those locations. So there are multiple reasons why this matters. First, on a general level, this just improves their quality of life. If they can actually subsidize themselves and feel empowered by that, that matters in and of itself. But more importantly, it provides them with the basic necessities that they need. It makes sure that they have access to healthcare, food, a house over their head. All those things really matter to a person's survival and capability of living well. Also, it decreases the number of deaths. All these things can cause death. They do cause death among the poor populations in this country. We need to reduce that as much as possible. As I said earlier, this breaks down the cycle of poverty, and it goes beyond just giving kids the opportunity to get more education and get better educated in line with their parents. Because it means that their parents don't that their parents can earn all their money through these fine legal avenues, which means that they don't have to pursue any kinds of illicit activities, which are unfortunately very common among the poor for this reason. And so we need some way to manage that. But lastly, this is a recognition of their basic humanity. The price of labor shouldn't be a race to the bottom. That's what creates sweatshops in many countries. We recognize something fundamental to our basic human decency when we set a minimum wage. We accept that labor is inextricable from the human beings who do it, and that therefore the labor itself has basic value that we must afford it. We accept that all humans have basic value, and that goes beyond our means. Otherwise, we wouldn't have emergency rooms to treat critically ill, regardless of their capacity to pay for it. The value should extend to the labor in which they engage. That labor has a basic value, and it should be honored with a basic price. To remove that is to devalue not only their labor, but their humanity. My second advantage, and I won't focus too long on this, is economics. We have a substantial economic problem. While unemployment is going down, economic growth is still stagnant in the US. This is the greatest indicator for the growth of any country, and it's one of the most important things we can focus on for the benefit of this country. The reasons we're not achieving that growth are many, but one of them is that a lot of companies are putting their finances in reserve, and as a means of dealing with possible future economic fallout. But as a result of all that saving, it's not fluxing back into the economy. Well, what do the poor do? They spend. They spend every single cent they get because they need to spend it in order to survive. So this provides a means for them to spend more, which all goes into the economy, which creates more economic flow. That's really important to an economy. And the economic system would be bettered by it. It would create growth through the system because more money would be fluxing through, and that's the benefit for them. Okay, that's my round.
Okay, guys, this is TeaPatriot, and I will focus on my 7-minute speech, and I will include rebuttals in the later rounds. Okay, so my first argument is morality, and morality of a fair market, or a free market to be example, is for the market to decide how much they should pay their workers. For example, a market can decide in an economic trough, for example, as the economy goes down, that in order to make their business survive, for example, they must cut their wages. And in an economic rise or peak, for example, businesses can give their laborers a better wage. But for the government to tell somebody that they must pay somebody $7.50, or what my opponent is advocating for $15, is actually very bad for the economy, and it actually hurts small businesses the worst. In America, one of our greatest assets is small business. In small business, we focus on individuals seeking the American life, making it out of nothing, and growing to be something big. The only thing, the only business that actually the minimum wage actually hurts is small business. Major corporations such as McDonald's, Walmart, they can afford to absorb the minimum wage hikes. But for example, a small bakery or a small business won't be able to afford a $15 wage for all their employees. And this brings me to my second point, unemployment. Let's say a business has 2 workers and they are both paid $7.50. If my opponent's advocacy comes true and the minimum wage is raised to $15, then the company will be forced to lay off 1 worker in order to make up profits because now instead of paying two workers $15, they have to pay one worker $15. And there's a positive correlation between raising the minimum wage and increasing in unemployment. Now, for example, I don't agree with just sweatshops and paying workers 0.10 cents a day. And that's simply not the case. It used to be the case in the Industrial Revolution and in state capitalist countries such as China. However, if you look at a truly free market economy such as Switzerland, if you have absolutely no minimum wage laws, the wages are bound to increase, not decrease. For example, the average wages for an American worker is around $10. However, the average wage for a Swiss worker is $25. So when you tell a business that they have to pay a worker a certain amount, or the government tells a business that they have to pay a certain amount, you are limiting the business and you are limiting the economy. So, but however, a higher minimum wage also increases the chances of kids dropping out of school in order to look for work, such as becoming a worker at McDonald's, for example, for a higher minimum wage. Not only that, but a higher minimum wage won't really do anything for the population. An economy runs on supply and demand. If there's too much supply, then the demand will decrease. And if there's too much demand, the supply will decrease. So when you give a worker $15, not only will the prices of the economy, such as basic necessities and other luxurious items, increase, there won't be any difference between giving the worker $15 or giving him 10 cents. Giving him 10 cents, for example, won't help the companies at all. For example, if you give every single worker in America 10 cents, then nobody will be able to buy a $3,000 TV. They'll be all struggling for necessities in the American economy. So decreasing the minimum wage isn't actually necessarily a bad thing, because while you decrease the minimum wage, necessities in our lives and luxuries in our lives, such as TVs, will also dramatically decrease. Also, in an economic trough, if you increase the minimum wage, then inflation will also be a massive factor in decreasing our economic growth. For example, if you give a worker $15, then the price of a burger might have to increase to also $15 as well to make up for the economic loss that the country is going through. So for all these reasons, I think the minimum wage should not only be lowered, but it should be abolished for the good of the economy and, more importantly, the good of the American worker. Thank you.
All right, so now we're going to start the crossfire. I'll start off with a question, and then you can ask me a question, okay? So you talk about inflation being a possibility. How does that happen in an environment where more people are spending more?
Okay, for example, if you give a minimum wage worker $15 and the company is losing that much amount of money, it has to replace the profits. So that will not only manage increased prices, but the minimum wage worker is not going to really make anything. So the prices not only go up in the economy, the wages are stagnant, basically.
Okay. You got a question?
So $15 an hour. There has been much research showing that as you increase the minimum wage, unemployment also increases. So how is your argument that you are helping poor people when you are really putting unskilled workers at a disadvantage?
I think you're making a general assumption that because something's increasing, something must decrease. I'm not viewing it that way. I'm viewing it as the minimum wage provides the means for people to spend, which means companies benefit from that and actually get more revenue as a result. I think that that's going to counter it. I also think that there are government subsidies that could counter those costs as well, but that's another issue. So you talk about the morality of a fair and free market. What does it matter? Why do we care about the morality of a fair and free market?
Because our country was founded on a free market society, and that free market society is to be beneficial to everybody, not for the people at the top, and also not for the people at the bottom. In a free market economic society, businesses should be able to decide what their workers should be paid, not the government. The government has zero interest in economic growth, and most likely they are interested in keeping their jobs. You can see this from Democrats who want to increase the wage to $15 or $10, and they do not base their increases on wages on economic models. If they base economic their decisions on economic models, you would see actually a decrease in the amount of support for a $15 minimum wage. So I believe that the interests of the economy should come first and not the interests of gaining another election term.
Okay. So that's the end of the crossfire round. I'll go ahead and start my second round. Okay, so for my second round, I'd like to thank my opponent for giving a very intriguing speech. I believe his position is a very good one, and so let's get started tackling it. So the first thing he talks about is the morality of the fair market, free market system. And he talks about how we should be able to have the freedom to move about in the system, and companies should be able to decide where they allocate resources. He doesn't explain why this is important. He doesn't explain why companies should be able to allocate with complete freedom of mobility on this. If they were able to do that, then what about safety concerns in their company? What about all manner of benefits that their people receive? There are a number of different things that are absolutely required for human survival, even on the job, let alone off the job. And basically, if we allow complete freedom on their part, that's what we're allowing. We're allowing a return to times when people would be put in dangerous situations while they're on the job in order to subsidize this freedom that he's talking about. There's no real benefit to this freedom either, because it's not providing any major advantage to them. And he doesn't really explain how this is going to happen. All he says is that it hurts small businesses worse, but he doesn't explain why. They hire a smaller amount of people. This isn't a massive cost increase, and yet for some reason he says that businesses that are much larger are able to employ all these people. First of all, that's over half of employees, so that means that for that half of employees, there is no net harm to any business. Those businesses can keep those costs under control and can manage to pay their people more. So for 50% of the population, there is no harm at all, even by his own analysis. But for small businesses, they receive tons of government subsidies. They receive means to make sure that they can pay their people these amounts. There's no reason that that wouldn't happen in this case. The thing he says during Crossfire is that we've been founded on a free market society, and therefore we need to embody the principles of a free market. Well, I don't think we were founded on a free market principle, especially considering we employed much of slavery with huge landowners that used indentured servitude in the early days of our country. So I don't think it was a free market unless you call an enslaving society free. But in this case, when he's talking, even if it is true, even if that is the free market society, he gives no basis why that free market society is something we should uphold. We uphold it in so many other aspects. Why in this specific aspect? Why is the minimum wage the most important thing to uphold it in? He doesn't explain why there's any major benefit to that, and there's no reason why we should uphold that. I think the benefit to the population is what we should look at first and foremost. And the people themselves, the ones who are dying because they lack the basic resources to survive, those are the ones we should care about first and foremost, rather than this broad generalist principle. Then he talks about unemployment. He talks about layoffs, and specifically how more people would be laid off as a result. He gives this very basic cost estimate. First of all, as I said during Cross-Act, subsidizing employers at least partially solves for this. And a lot of these employers are subsidized, particularly small businesses. Second, raising earnings also bolsters the company. Henry Ford made this very clear with his model. The idea was he'd give his employees more funds, and as a result, they'd purchase from him, which means they'd actually get more revenue in the company. That's where his cost estimate fundamentally breaks down. If these people are getting more funds, as I've argued, they will spend those funds in their company, which means there will be more revenues for the company. If there are more revenues for the company, there's no problem with employing the same number of people because they have more funds to employ with. He says he doesn't agree with sweatshops, but he's allowing the bottom to fall out of their basic wages. He's not providing a means for those wages to go back up. He talks about competition providing that, but competition for wages exists in status quo. The only difference is whether there's a basic minimum for those wages, and yet there's no major competition to increase wages anywhere. No one is actually increasing the wages like he says they should be. That means that competition would only be a race to the bottom, as I argued in my opening round. The only thing he provides as a basis for this is that there's a Swiss system. First of all, the Swiss system is based mainly in government subsidies, so the government subsidizes a tremendous amount of the workers and their actual benefits within the country. But second, the Swiss system is absolutely not comparable to the United States. They are not nearly as capitalist focused as we are, and they are not as strong of a free market society as he says. And so, as a result, there's no reason to believe that there would be a race up if following the bottom of the minimum wage falling out. That doesn't make any sense from even a logical standpoint. He says that a higher minimum wage means more dropouts from school. He gives no warrant for this. There's no reason to believe that many of these high schoolers who would often take on an extra job to help keep their families alive in any case while they're going to school are all of a sudden going to start dropping out of school in major droves. People are still going to stay in school, and as I've argued in my opening round, they're going to have their parents' support because their parents aren't going to be absolutely desperate and working multiple jobs, which means they're going to do better in school. So he talks about supply and demand and give a worker $15 and the prices increase. He gives really no warrant for this. He keeps talking about how, oh, if costs are increasing, then prices must increase. There's no reason why that's true if revenues for these companies are also increasing. If the workers are actually spending their money in these companies, that means that the company's gaining back all the money they put in the first place, which means that they're not having to put the costs elsewhere because there are no costs anymore. The costs are being obviated by the spending of their own employees. That's it.
Okay, back to my morality argument. A rebuttal of your rebuttal. It is immoral to tell an employer at your standards of $15, and it is very immoral to tell an employee you cannot make a contract with your employer for $14. Under your system, an increase to $15, an employee who may not qualify for his productivity of a $15 minimum wage, he will not qualify for a 14. He won't be able to do a contract with his employer for $14. I think that's very immoral, and that is one of the reasons why unemployment increases when there is a minimum wage increase. If an employer can't have a reason to employ somebody for $15 if their productivity demands $13 or $12, then they just simply won't hire them. And that's how unemployment increases. And to the argument of why our system wasn't under a free market, slavery has nothing to do with a free market. Those slaves were bought and they were used under a free market system. Now, I know it doesn't sound like they're free, they were slaves, but our slave trade was based on a free trade system. We traded with Africa, we traded with Europe in a triangular trade in order to get slaves. We gave them rum, and that's how the system was created. I'm not saying that was good, but to say that we weren't based on a free market system because of slavery is just simply not true. Slavery had almost everything to do with a free market system. Now, I'm not saying it's good, of course, but to say that it's not, it's just utter false. To go on to your point about high school students dropping out to get a minimum wage, that's actually extremely true. When you right now, instead of working, and in several public schools, many children just feel the need to just drop out and go for a minimum wage job. And right now, the minimum wage is simply $7.25. So let's say that your hypothesis is true and that prices won't increase, rents won't increase, everything will stay the same, and the wages are exactly just going to increase, nothing bad's going to happen. That gives them more incentive to drop out and get a $15. You're giving them twice the amount of income. And instead of going to boring school and learning about all these things that they don't like, they can simply drop out, get a $15 minimum wage job, and have a happy life. So under your idea, a minimum wage job, to be honest, is not supposed to be a real job. It's a minimum wage job. You're just supposed to have it for a temporary amount of time before you move on to your next thing. What you're saying, and one of the incentives of having a temporary minimum job is that you have to work multiple minimum wage jobs, increasing your stress levels and decreasing your happiness. What you're providing and what you're incentivizing is that instead of taking 2 or 3 minimum wage jobs, you're saying, okay, you know what, we'll just give you one minimum wage job, you'll be perfectly fine. That actually increases people's poverty and decreases their amount of success, because instead of moving on from a minimum wage job, many people will be just happily content to stay in their position. And to rebut your other point about poverty, I don't just support abolishing the minimum wage and then just leaving it there and people fending for themselves. I believe in the ITC, the UBI, and negative tax income to help poor people um, survive and to take burden off their taxes. And I completely agree with that, but it's just you can't incentivize workers to stay on a minimum wage job and then expect growth. So that's it for my rebuttal.
Okay, so now we'll start the second cross-X. I'll have you start this time. Okay, ready, go.
Okay, so you said that, and I brought it up a little bit in my rebuttal, giving incentives for minimum wage jobs. So instead of taking 3 or 2 minimum wage jobs, a person can simply take one minimum wage job and provide for his family. Do you think that is really helpful for economic growth for somebody to just be content on their jobs and then not want to achieve success in a later thing?
I'd say being content in a job is great for general quality of life. I think that's fantastic if people are content in a job, and if they happen to be content in a minimum wage job, why not? That's fine. The fact that they wouldn't be working themselves ragged is actually really beneficial. But even if, but I mean, we have to recognize that people would be able to still move up in pay if they decided to go to school and actually get a better job. I don't think anyone's going to ignore that benefit on the basis that, oh, well, I'm earning a decent amount, I guess I'll stay in this job that I don't really like to do, even though it's paying me pretty well. So I think people will try to move up regardless. So you talked about how it's immoral to tell an employer to have to pay more and immoral to tell employees that they can't work for less. I don't really see the harm. What exactly is the harm of telling people these things?
Okay, the harm is that let's say we're back in the 1960s, correct? Milton Friedman actually gave a great speech on this. If a black employee wants to work at your job, let's say that, and he doesn't really qualify for a $7.50 minimum wage, much less than a $15 minimum wage. You are subjecting him to unemployment because you cannot simply lower his wage just so he can get a job. So now what you have is basically what you talked about, a cycle of poverty. This person might not be as productive as somebody else who can have a $7.50 wage, and he might not be that productive. So what you're giving employers the right to do basically is to give them the right to lower the wages and let that person have a job. Unfortunately, under your system, the government is telling the free market, you cannot pay under this amount. So basically what happens is that this black person now, he can't get a job anywhere though, because now the minimum wage is $15 and he didn't even qualify for a 750. So now what you have is basically a subjection of to unemployment, and this is why you see massive unemployment as soon as you raise the minimum wage.
Okay. I'll get started with my final round. 5 minutes. Ready and go. So let's take a step back from the debate. Think a little about what's actually gone on here. We've talked a lot about the minimum wage, and we've talked a lot of back and forth. He said, she said in this case. Well, he said in this case. But there's a lot of things that are going on here. The main thing that is almost unaddressed throughout the entire debate is poverty. I talked a lot in my opening round about the importance of poverty and the importance of raising people's quality of life and reducing the number of deaths. This is never addressed. At any point throughout the debate, my opponent has never addressed this point, which means that for the people who are currently receiving minimum wage, they are essentially relegated to a terrible quality of life and a more certain death. That is millions of people across the country. All those people at least have a chance of having a job with a higher minimum wage, which means that they have the ability to increase their quality of life and reduce the number of deaths that are occurring. That's huge. That is the major impact of this debate, and it should be taken as the biggest thing to go around. The other part of that impact is the cycle of poverty argument. I talked about how fewer illicit activities would happen among these people, which means they would be less relegated to crime. I talked about how the importance of education, having parents around in order to help their children's education, is extremely important to that. He does not address this. Third, I talked about the recognition of basic humanity, and this is where his final round argument really his last round argument really gets him. He talks about giving the employers the right to reduce wages somehow allows you to employ more people. Let's say that's true. It is an absolute race to the bottom. It is quantifying people in a way that says your productivity is less, you are less important, you are less worthy of our basic ability to survive within this country. That should be removed from you. You should have to work more jobs. You should have to work harder and put yourself at greater risk as a result. That is something that we should work against. We should recognize their basic humanity by recognizing that their labor has value and matters. With regards to economics, I talked a lot in the opening round about how the revenues that they spend as part of these finances are going to come right back into the company. Now, my opponent really hasn't addressed this to a great degree. In fact, he seems to concede it in his final round. The reality is that the country is far more benefited by the presence of this increased spending within the country. As a result, the entire country grows, which means the government has more funds to spend subsidizing these companies, especially when you're talking about small businesses. This is huge. This means that they are able to subsidize basically all of the funding that they need to spend in order to increase the minimum wage for their employees and still see growth for the country and company as a whole. That's huge for both of them, and that means that as a whole, the country is going to economically, and more people are going to advance economically. The only real response he's given to this is that it's immoral to tell an employer what they have to pay and immoral to tell employees that they can't work for less. This, at best, is a relatively mediocre argument for why people might want to do something. Sure, we're removing a bit of the freedom from the system. They won't be able to define their wages below $15. Is that really such a bad thing? Does that tell them anything terrible? The reality is that there is a solid benefit here. It's a benefit to the people, it's a benefit to the economy at large, and it's a benefit to the companies. Now, we may have a history of free trade. I really don't think our system of free trade was actually made emblematic through the African slave trade, where they literally stole people and shipped them overseas to us. That's not exactly free market, but fine, let's assume that that is free market. That's not a good system. That's not a beneficial system in and of itself. We need a system that recognizes basic humanity. The worst case scenario he presents is that people would have a happy life living in a minimum wage job. How terrible. Let's have happy lives. Let's bring more people happy lives. At the very least, that's something for people to live on. In the current situation, they do not have happy lives. They have to work multiple jobs. They are made destitute. Okay. So when you're ready.
Okay, so my opponent, and I would like to thank my opponent for the debate. My opponent brings up three main things: poverty, unemployment, and minimum wage workers having a happy life. So first, let me tackle poverty. So I will concede to my opponent that poverty does go down when there is a minimum wage. There are statistics and there is analysis to prove that. However, unemployment statistically rises as you increase the minimum wage. So you have more people unemployed on the streets. They don't know what to do. They don't have any jobs and they're on welfare. So I would argue that unemployment is simply more important than more people having money. So to the second point, a race to a bottom in terms of wages. My opponent doesn't really necessarily tell why this is wrong. I've already explained why in a supply and demand economic system, which all economic systems follow, as you increase supply, demand is lowered, and if you increase demand, supply is lowered. So if you give everybody, let's say, 5 cents, because that's probably the worst that my opponent can think of in terms of wage lowering. So the amount of demand for products extremely goes down, and the demand for products in that regard, and the supply goes extremely up. And that is not beneficial to any business owner for their supply to go up and demand go down. So the argument of the race to the bottom doesn't really do anything. For example, if the minimum wage pays 5 cents, then a meal at a fast food place will be like 2 cents or 3 cents. So my opponent doesn't really help the viewers understand why a race to the bottom is necessarily bad. As for the third thing, minimum wage people being happy, I am all for people being happy, but we have to understand that in a capitalist society, we need more entrepreneurs, we need more private business owners, and simply having minimum wage jobs be really incentivized and people be happy that they have them is really doing a disservice to our capitalist system. We need more people to have more innovative ideas, and they simply can't have that if they are just so happy that they get $15 for flipping burgers. So I'd like to thank my opponent for the debate, and that's all.